we're just going to take a moment to show something from old osteopathic literature and then to suggest some challenges with the description of it, as well as some suggestions for alteration. So essentially, if you look back in older osteopathic literature, one of the things that you'll see with respect to treating the neck is they will speak specifically about essentially grabbing the base of the skull and under the chin to work on the neck. Usually, in depictions that you're able to find, the practitioner would be standing. I'm not going to do that just based on the nature of the video and the way that I've set this up, and also personal preference. All right, so what they're telling you to do is essentially be back here. Just make sure your tongue isn't between your teeth. Okay. You grab under here, and you create traction, and you go left, and you go right with that traction. Okay. Now, as you heard me say prior to doing anything with this patient, to make sure that their tongue isn't between their teeth, because if you grab under the chin, you automatically pull the chin to, essentially you close the mouth. So if the tongue is between the teeth, you'll force the person to more or less bite their own tongue. So what you can see is that my forearm comes down the side of the head and then underneath. The other challenge here is if my hand is in a specific position, I may not necessarily know. If I go a little bit further down, I could basically be creating some pressure on the patient's airway, making them very uncomfortable. They could feel like they're choking. It's very uncomfortable. The other deal is that here, once I do this, my ability to kind of go left and right, this is a very biased hold. All right, at a certain point, I'm gonna kind of get in the way. This is a very biased hold. One arm's up here, one arm's behind. I'm blocking the face. Now I can create a fair amount of motion should I need to, as far as rotation is concerned in the cervical column. The problem is it's biased. I have to do a lot of wiggling, a lot of contorting. A way that you can adjust this should you need to. So the same idea of contact as control and control as safety, as well as patient positioning. So the space between us is unstable, right? So minimizing negative space. I can come in nice and tight, right? If I do want to use a hold like that, I come in really close, right? Now I can grab here, really good traction. Now the problem here becomes more visible because as I rotate, he can go no farther than when my arm hits the table. And also, basically what happens is, I don't know if you can see this, but my wrist really hits his collarbone. So now I've created a wedge or a block that we can't go beyond, right? So it becomes a very biased hold. Something like this is really good for very strong traction if you happen to need it. And you don't pull with your arms, you basically glue yourself right in tight to the patient, and then what you do very purposely is just lean your whole body back. You don't move your arms, you lean your whole body back. But because of the bias of the hold, what ends up happening is I might run into the patient's collarbone with my hand. So if I go far enough here, right? Even in this situation, when I'm further back, I run into his collarbone and I can go no farther than that. So his neck can go farther. I can't access that range of motion. The kind of one hand high, one hand low means that I have to contort my body a little bit. So something that you can do is, instead of cupping, right, when I'm holding that way, what I'm going to do is my thumb's going to be wide and the rest of my fingers are going to be coming underneath more or less the occipital region. What I tend to do, now not everybody is going to want to do it this way, but what I tend to do is actually bring my thumbs up around the ears so that my entire hand essentially splays out. So it's almost like this, right? So although there's space between my fingers, what I have is more points of contact, more ability to mold to the base of the skull. So if I'm holding here, right, if I'm holding down here, I'm more likely to slide. But if I go around here, I've got more contact with the patient's head and skull and whatnot. I can still create some reasonable traction where needed. If I need more traction in the cervical region, I can get it. But here, when I'm holding here, my hands are not going to run into the patient's clavicle or into the patient in any way. So I can get much greater rotation, right? And then I use the table to help support me, right? So now, let's just say I want to work into left rotation and use traction. So I get into left rotation, I come in tight, and then I can create my traction, right? But at this point, I'm not underneath. So again, the classical description of being underneath the chin, as you turn in a direction, whichever hand you have under the chin, you're going to run into their clavicle, so be careful with that. And then here, right, instead of holding at the base of the skull and really trying to wrap around the occiput, you'll slide, right? It's easy to slide. If you just have a really broad hold on essentially as much of the patient's skull as you can do a lot of different things. You can get good traction or reasonable traction, right? So I lean back, I get my traction, and then for the method that is described in old osteopathic textbooks, where it's essentially create traction and create motion left and right of the neck, generally speaking, to loosen the muscle. So essentially it's traction and articulation at the same time. I can do it like this. I don't slide as much. I don't have to worry about the patient biting their own tongue, and I don't have to worry about my hand running into their clavicle, blocking the motion. So again, the old descriptions talk about grabbing underneath the chin. And even if I was standing up, at some point as I turn, I'm going to run into their clavicle. If the patient has more available range that I need to explore beyond where my hand hits the clavicle, I don't have that accessible to me. So what I would generally suggest, if you're trying to create traction, if you're trying to create general cervical articulation, basically get a hold. This is like a palpation concept that we've spoken about before. Get as much as you can touch, and then also, generally speaking, broad contact for multi-point discrimination. That mixes into broad, where contact is control. Just a very, very broad hold on everything, and then I can do the same thing. And as I turn, my hand that's underneath the head essentially ends up being supported on the table or the pillow. So I don't have to do as much work. The table does some work for me at that point. So all of that combined to say the old hold or the old description looks like this. You may run into their clavicle, right? You have to worry about them not biting their tongue. You have to worry about not choking them or not blocking the airway. But if you change your hold to this, you get the same net effect without the negatives.